Well, Judah has found itself in a very precarious situation. They are facing attacks by three different nations: Syria, Edom, and Philistia. Well, rather than recognize the situation that they are in, King Ahaz, instead of recognizing that God is the only one that could pull them through that type of situation, he decides that he is going to seek help from another source. He decides that he is going to go to the king of Assyria. He recognizes that Assyria has a very strong army. They are a growing kingdom at this point. And he hopes that he will be able to go to the king of Assyria and gain his support, become an ally of Assyria, and then the Assyrians would be there to come to their assistance. So as we noted last week, there in 2 Kings 16 and verse 7, it says that he took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and he sent it as a present to the king of Assyria. So he goes, he's hoping to entice the king of Assyria to agree to this alliance. But whenever he goes and he meets with Assyria, the king of Assyria accepts the gift, but he refuses to enter into the alliance. So he takes all of this silver and gold, weakening the financial status of Judah even more so. But then he basically says, you're on your own. We're not going to come to your aid. We're not going to help you. Well, over time, we find eventually Assyria did go into battle with their neighbor Syria. Now, you may remember last week we talked about there's a little bit of confusion there because the names are so similar. These are not one and the same. These are two separate kingdoms. And so we find that eventually Assyria goes to battle with Syria, and in that battle they conquer the Syrian capital, which was the city of Damascus, and they put to death the Syrian king. But we find in this, the Bible tells us that even though Syria has now been driven back, has now been forced away from Judah's borders, it really doesn't provide much relief for Judah. Assyria was not doing this to benefit anyone but themselves. They went in and they claimed all of that territory that had been the possession of Syria. They went in and they claimed that for themselves. So Ahaz, he now is in an even worse predicament than he was before. Because now, even though one of those kingdoms that had come up against him has now been defeated, he knows that it's just a matter of time before Assyria is going to come against Judah. And so rather than, once again, turn to God for help, he decides that he needs to turn to another source. Well, the king of Assyria has already turned him down. But while he was in Damascus, meeting with the king of Assyria, he noticed an altar that had been built to one of their false gods. And to use our modern terminology, he fell in love with this altar. It was beautiful, it was ornate, it just something about this altar just drew his attention. And so he goes to the Assyrians and he gets the blueprints for this altar. And he sends it back, these blueprints, he sends it back to Jerusalem to the priest Urijah, and he tells Urijah to build an altar just like this altar he had seen in Damascus. Well, Urijah gets to work, and by the time that Ahaz arrives back in Jerusalem, this altar is complete. Well, the text tells us that Ahaz immediately begins offering sacrifices upon this altar. 2 Kings 16:13 says that he offered burnt offerings, grain offerings, drink offerings, and peace offerings. Now, these were all offerings that the Levites, the priests from the tribe of Levi, were authorized to offer on behalf of that nation. But there was a condition. They were only to be offered upon the altar in the temple. They were only to be offered upon that altar that had been built by Moses according to God's specifications. But notice what Ahaz has done. He has now started offering these sacrifices that should be offered to God, but he's offering them on an altar to a false god. But then, to add insult to injury even more so, he goes into the temple and he has this altar that had been built to God's specifications. He takes and has it moved. He moves it out of the place of prominence, as we might say. He puts it over along the wall in the corner. And he brings his altar to this false god and sets it up in the temple of God. Now, something that I find very interesting. Why would he keep the old altar? If he wasn't going to use it, if he was going to use just this new one, why would he keep that old altar? Well, the Bible tells us why. It tells us the reason that he did this, according to 2 Kings 16:16, was so that it could be used to inquire of God. Basically, we don't want to do anything else in reference to God on this altar, but if we ever have any kind of issue where we need to go and communicate to God, we want to keep this old altar here so that we can do that. So he decides that they're going to keep that on hand, but all of their worship was now going to be performed on an altar to a false god. Well, then Ahab, he goes in and he has many of the other items used in the temple for the worship of God. He has them deconstructed. He goes through the land and has many things destroyed that indicated the worship of God. And then eventually, he completely shut the doors of the temple to worship. Worship was no longer being held in the temple. People were no longer allowed to enter into that place. And then he went through, and in every city in Judah, he had altars to false gods erected. So we see the rapid decline that took place when he turned away from God. Well, 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 22, describing the response of Ahaz. During this time of national crisis, it says that King Ahaz became increasingly unfaithful to the Lord. You see what was happening as each tactic that he tried failed. As each source that he thought would come to his aid rejected him. Rather than that turning him back to God, it turned him farther away from God. And he became more and more depraved in his practices as things went along. Well, Ahaz, he died ultimately at the young age of 36. The Bible doesn't tell us what contributed to his death, but he died at 36. He was buried in Jerusalem, but like the wicked kings before him, he was not allowed to be buried with the kings. So what are some applications we see from Ahaz? Well, the first one is this, folks. Just because someone hits rock bottom, it doesn't mean automatically they're going to turn to God. Ahaz, the text tells us, became increasingly unfaithful to the Lord. When he hit rock bottom and desperately needed help, he didn't turn to God. He tried to turn to Assyria first. Then he turned to an Assyrian false god. Those things didn't work. He looked everywhere and looked to everyone other than God. You know, so many times we hear people say, well, you got to hit rock bottom before you can look up. And with some people that is true. We probably all have known people in this life that they had to go through very dark times before they finally came to a realization of where they were. You know, you think about the prodigal son. You know, he found himself, being forced to feed swine, which as a Jew was a capital offense. But in that passage it says, but he came to himself. He came to his senses. He realized what he had done wrong, and it says he remembered. He knew that he could go back to his father's house. Well, the thing with Ahaz, he never came to himself. He never remembered that he could go back to God. He just continued to go down that dark path until ultimately he died at a very young age. Another lesson that we learn is this. And folks, this is something that especially in the religious climate that we see around us today, and we see this creeping in even more so in the Lord's church than we have in many, many years. We need to be aware of those who want to turn worship into what they want rather than what God wants. You look at what we see in this account. Ahaz went and he removed the authorized altar, replaced it with what he wanted. He went in and he wanted something new, wanted something up to date, something fresh, something different. And ultimately what happened? Worship in the temple completely ceased. Eventually they turned to worshiping false gods. But we're living in an age where worship has become more about entertainment than reverence. We're living in an age where it's more about tickling the ears of the worshipers than it is honoring the one that we're worshiping. Folks, when we come here into this place, the things that we engage in are directed to God. Now, the joy that we feel by being here, the encouragement that we get, those are simply byproducts of the service that we give to God. When we come together, we're to worship in the way that God has established. But for many people, Ahaz included, God's way was not good enough. It wasn't enticing enough. He wanted an update. But that was not pleasing in Ahaz's day, and it's not pleasing in our day. We have to honor God in all that we do, and whatever we do in word or deed is to be done in the name or by the authority of Jesus Christ. Okay. Anything about King Ahaz? Any questions or comments before we move on? Yes, sir.
I've got a question. In your study of any of this, and I just wondered, it kind of came up in my mind when I was thinking about this, is like Uriah, the priest, and with other kings that were evil, do we have any record, or do we know even from external history, did they ever try to oppose the kings on this? I mean, Uriah had to know this was wrong. Were they so afraid of their lives that they didn't resist? Or do you think they just believed it too and wanted to go along with it?
Well, there are some instances. Remember was it Uzziah that went into the temple and was was burning incense that was unauthorized, and the priests and the prophets came before him and called him out for what he was doing? You do have a few instances scattered in there, but for the most part, the priests usually went along with whatever the king wanted. In a lot of ways, the position of the priest had become more of a political figure. And we really see that as we come into the New Testament. They not so much so had their focus on spiritual things any longer. It was more preserving the peace. And that's what we really see a lot with a lot of these priests.
Hand in hand with another lesson we can learn from that. Just if the leaders go astray, it's still if they're against God's will, then we don't need to agree with them or be.
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely. No, our number one loyalty is to God. It's to God.
But these people doing wrong, they are so brainwashed and so, got it in their head that their way is right, that they can't see the right way. And I see that in today talking to some people. They are so brainwashed that they cannot see the truth.
That's right. And it's a sad situation. that many people find themselves in. But, all we can do is proclaim the truth. All we can do is teach the truth and hope that people's eyes will be opened, hope that they will, their hearts aren't so hard that they won't hear the truth. Do what? That's right. Pray for them, encourage them, teach by example, do what we can to live out our faith.
We're seeing it every day.
We do, yes. We see it all around us.
All around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it's not something that is a reality just in our time. I mean, look at how many times that we read in the Bible of times where, the thoughts of a man's heart was on evil entirely. I mean, all the time, all they thought about was evil things. And all but one family was wiped out off the face of the earth. I mean, that's hard to imagine. And then, so many other times, you look at all of these instances we're seeing through the study of the kings, and a lot of that we can place the blame at their leadership, but not always.
But what really gets me is the kings, they eventually turned and went their own way and away from God. But everybody else followed like sheep. That's sad that nobody stood up and said, hey, we're not doing this. We need to continue praying to God, not...
That's right. But Barb, you go back and you look at the message that Samuel took to the people whenever they first started crying out for a king. He said, this is what's going to happen to the nation. This is the kind of leader that you're going to have. But they wouldn't listen. They said, no, we want a king like everybody else. We want a king. We want to be like everybody else. And look at where it led them.
Down the wrong road.
Down the wrong road.